Welcome back to another installation of our series on diplomacy and critical mineral access in Africa. One of the longest enduring challenges for Africa in many parts has been the persistence of armed conflict between states in the form of civil war. Today, war and strife test the societies of the Sudan, DRC, and the Sahel, to name just a few. Though obviously these wars have brought a horrific toll on civilians and the social fabric of society, observers from the US may also note that a number of these conflicts have worsened the development situation in these countries by scaring off foreign investment or the opportunities for job growth and enterprise. In the DRC, for example, rebels from the March 23rd movement have reportedly been involved in seizing, smuggling, and taxing gold and coltan. This has made legitimate business practices extremely difficult, and the ability for the US to engage in meaningful business partnerships virtually impossible. The peace resolution of these conflicts is not only a moral imperative, but also in the strategic interests of US gaining critical mineral access in countries like the Congo. Joining us today is former Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, Ambassador Tibor Nagy. Ambassador Nagy has served previously as the ambassador to Guinea and to Ethiopia. He has extensive experience in the diplomatic field and great familiarity with African affairs. Today, he will help us get a better understanding of these conflicts and how the U.S. can work to provide a solution. Ambassador Nagy, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure, Colin. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you. So I want to start off by mentioning you were ambassador to Ethiopia during a significant portion of the Ethiopian-Eritrean War at the turn of the century, correct?
Correct.
Can you talk a little bit what it was like working in that embassy, being in country during that conflict, and what kind of things the U.S. did to address it at the time?
Yeah, it was a very interesting situation. When I got there to take over the embassy, the war had already been going on for a while, and unfortunately, the United States was seen in a very bad light in Ethiopia. The Ethiopians felt very strongly that the Eritreans had been the aggressors, but the U.S. policy at the time, Susan Rice was the assistant secretary. U.S. policy at the time was to play more or less a neutral role so that the U.S. could be seen as an honest broker by both sides, which of course the Ethiopians did not at all appreciate because they expected the United States to come down squarely on the side of Ethiopia, tell the Eritreans they were the aggressors, and to go back to their own country. Um, it was very difficult. The mission itself was not physically threatened, so there was not a chance that the Eritreans were going to bomb Addis Ababa. So, we did not have to send home our diplomats or our family members or anything like that. But it was very difficult doing business with the Ethiopian government because of their intense dislike for us. As a matter of fact, during that time, the Ethiopian government organized a protest against the embassy, and they had not allowed a protest in so many years that they were not very good at dealing with it. So when 10,000 angry Ethiopians showed up and threw rocks at the embassy, the Ethiopian government security forces were not well prepared to deal with it. They finally were able to get a handle on it, but they broke out all the windows in one of the outer buildings of the embassy, and our diplomats went through quite a scary time, uh, hunkering down when everything was going on. The situation improved dramatically. I'll tell you, one of the things that improved the situation was Ethiopia, as it happens from time to time, was facing a famine. And the Americans, as we always are, were the first on the scene with an actual food delivery shipment within 6 weeks. And that, I think, really impressed the Ethiopians. And then Susan Rice, and then National Security Advisor at the time, Tony Lake, Gail Smith were undertaking kind of a shuttle diplomacy between Addis Ababa and Asmara. And eventually, they, working with the Algerians, were able to cobble together a ceasefire. Of course, it helped that the Ethiopians broke through the Eritrean lines and could have marched into Asmara. So, the Eritreans were ready for peace. The Ethiopians knew that they could not conquer the whole country physically because the Eritreans, the topography is very rough. So the Americans played a major role. After that, the situation became much calmer and the relations became much more positive. So when September 11th came around, Ethiopia was one of the most fervent supporters of the United States in Africa to help us in our counterterrorism efforts.
Fascinating. And you mentioned the U.S. policy of neutrality in that conflict. For our viewers' awareness, how does that policy priority get set and sort of distributed and enacted down the chain? Does it set by Congress, the Secretary of State, the ambassador, et cetera?
Well, I think in that particular case, it was basically said by Susan Rice, who was Assistant Secretary of State and had, of course, very close work and relations with the Secretary. So she was basically driving Africa policy and getting support from the National Security Council. She was out traveling in the field when the war popped up because Eritrea's attack was totally unanticipated. And she decided right then that she was going to try and very quickly stop the fighting. That's why I think that initially that neutrality, was the official policy. The war did not stop, and by then it was too late for the United States to, I think, to go in a different, policy area. Our ambassador in Addis Ababa at the time, before me, felt very strongly that the United States should be coming down on the side of Ethiopia, and that caused, of course, a certain amount of friction between the embassy and Washington.
Very interesting. And during your time in that office, what did you notice about, or what did you observe regarding commercial access for U.S. business and the ability for American businesses to reach Ethiopian markets or work in manufacturing, et cetera? How hampered was that by the conflict?
I would say not too much because, for example, at that time, Ethiopia was one of the largest customers for Boeing aircraft. And Ethiopian Airlines, even though it was a government-owned company, it had a great deal of independence of action. So while I was there, they only bought Boeing airplanes. After that, they also started buying some Airbus, but then they were only buying. So that wasn't really impacted. Otherwise, Starbucks was very interested in buying Ethiopian coffee. Again, the Ethiopians were eager to sell that, but there was not a great deal of U.S. investment at the time, so it was not really a factor of keeping U.S. investors out. If it had been a different time period or a different country, then the policy probably would have impacted U.S. investment in a very negative fashion.
Sure, very interesting. Um, I want to take a look at the conflict that formally came to an end in June with the peace agreement between the Democratic Republic of Congo and Rwanda, but for all intents and purposes has seemingly persisted. Um, for those unaware, this conflict goes back to some of the history between the Tutsi and Hutu ethnic groups in Rwanda and in the DRC. And I think you would agree essentially comes down to a power struggle between Paul Kagame, the leader of Rwanda's government, and the DRC's government. What do you see as being the sort of long-term solution to this? Do you think Rwanda is going to be willing to back down from their support for rebel groups in DRC? Do you think DRC is going to be able to stage any kind of a comeback?
I'm glad you went into the complexities of the situation because it is much more complex than many people realize. It's not just going back to the Rwanda genocide against the Tutsi. It's what happened after that, that literally hundreds of thousands of Hutus, because the government was controlled by the Hutus during the genocide. When the Tutsis took over, Paul Kagame's group, the Rwanda Patriotic Front, took over. Hundreds of thousands of the Hutus fled into mostly the Democratic Republic of Congo and others, and they created a kind of a Hutu militia whose intent was to eventually go back and overthrow the Rwandan Patriotic Front government. That group, I believe called the FDLR, still exists in Eastern Congo, and that is the main point of contention. That is the reason that the Rwandan government, Paul Kagame's administration, basically supported the M23 movement so that also so that they could look after the interests of Tutsis who live in Eastern Congo because Tutsis, you know, again, going back, colonial borders don't make any sense whatsoever. So that's one of the tragedies of Africa is that these borders split ethnic groups and threw together ethnic groups that had historical hatreds against each other. So with that, the FDLR is there, and Rwanda will support the M23 as long as the FDLR is there and active. Rwanda is counting on the Congolese government to be able to disarm and physically remove the FDLR from threatening Rwanda. So to me, that is the essential question. It's not a piece of paper that Rwanda and Congo are going to sign. It's, is Congo capable of removing the FDLR? Because until it does so, M23 is going to be a major, major problem in Eastern Congo. And if the M23 really wanted to set off for Kinshasa, I doubt if anybody could really stop them.
Interesting. So it sounds like you are doubtful about the prospects of the diplomatic solution that the U.S. negotiated working out. Is that accurate?
I'm circumspect.
Okay.
I'm hesitant to say that it's going to work because it was a feel-good moment for everybody to get together and sign a piece of paper and smile and shake hands. Uh, Tshisekedi's position is much weaker than Paul Kagame's. He has threats from all over the place. He's surrounded by an entourage whose whose ethics and scruples are highly suspect. There are other problems in other parts of the DRC. Um, and then there's Rwanda. Some people refer to Rwanda as the Sparta of Africa. The Rwandan armed forces could probably handle almost any other armed forces in Africa, as we're seeing what they're doing in Mozambique against Islamic extremists. So yeah, I'm kind of hesitant to say it's going to succeed. If the deal is right and if there's enough of a win-win-win, then it can work. But at the end of the day, I suspect what would have to happen is that Rwanda, through M23 possibly, would have to be given the go-ahead to neutralize the FDLR, because I'm just not sure that the Congolese armed forces is either fully willing or able to do that.
It's interesting. So, given the vast mineral wealth of the DRC and the um, abundant opportunities they have to be a successful government, why do you think the government has failed so dramatically in resisting this rebel movement? Why do you think they've struggled to really get any kind of a military defense
Well,
moving?
because the institutions of the state have been corrupted for decades, going almost back to the independence of Congo and then the long period of time of Mobutu, being in power and him actually encouraging his military to shake down and brutalize the population. The customs in the military of senior officers stealing the money, and the soldiers on the ground not getting their pay, not being supported, not having ammunition for their weapons, being poorly led, being poorly motivated. I mean, if you're in that kind of a situation, would you want to sacrifice your life for your country, knowing that you're sacrificing your life for a bunch of corrupt elites who don't really care about you or your family? So it's human nature and it's logical.
Right, of course. I think the thing that's interesting to a lot of folks that have looked at the conflict from the U.S. angle is uh, we rely pretty heavily on coltan and cobalt for a lot of our um, aerodynamic technologies, national security technologies, and so much of it is abundantly found in the DRC. So I think a lot of people that observe this conflict are looking to maybe something of a quick resolution so that the US can get back to having secure access to those minerals. I'm going to start by asking how feasible you think that is, and then later I'll ask what you think the path to that kind of solution would look like.
I think it can be feasible, but I'm not sure it can be done with a grand deal between the DRC and Rwanda and of bringing peace that way. It might be much more feasible by focusing on the specific locales where these minerals exist in a in a shape that is worth exploiting, because without making peace between the two protagonists, you could still find ways to make peace on the ground where these minerals are found and extract them and and get them out. If you were to come up with a grand bargain, Rwanda's in on it, DRC's in on it, they demobilize the FDLR. Rwanda stops supporting the M23 and tells them to cool it. The M23, instead of promoting insecurity, actually promotes security. Uh, then the DRC and Rwanda can both enrich themselves. Maybe the DRC or Rwanda would do the processing so that it would move up the industrial chain. That would be fantastic. And that's the kind of deal that would really benefit the population because they would have peace, stability, employment, and then sharing some of the national wealth that would come off of there. Unfortunately, that scenario would take a lot of big ifs to make happen.
Interesting. So you think the optimal solution would be something of a, or how do I say this? The optimal solution might be something of a grand bargain, but the practical one looks more like local work, on the ground work. I'm curious
Yeah.
for U.S. diplomats, for U.S. policymakers, who do you think enacts that? Who do you think enforces that? How do you go about it?
Well, it would mean work, a lot of work from maybe special envoys from the embassy, from different government units on the part of the United States, and working very closely. You have to get the two governments on board also, but then finding local people to work with. I mean, the Chinese managed to do this. The Chinese managed to operate mines and industries in fairly hot regions, which are not very peaceful and not stable. Of course, they do a lot of work, and of course, they have a totally different state model where President Xi Jinping can order any company to go anywhere in the world and do business, whether they want to or not. We're not that way, but I think with the right inducements, we can also get, either American corporations or corporations that America would not find objectionable to operate in places like that and work with local officials to make it happen. It just depends on how important do we consider that for American interests to figure
Mhm.
out how much work it will take. Because if it's very, very important, then the US resources would be available to make it work. If we just say it's important, but we don't apply the resources, then obviously it's not going to happen.
Sure. So you touched on something I think is kind of interesting there, which is that countries like China that have state-owned enterprises are able to essentially wave a magic wand and enact business in those areas. In the U.S., obviously, you need private businesses to go in there voluntarily to pursue contracts or to pursue mining rights. So, do you think the U.S. has an incentive structure which is conducive of doing that if it is if it is important, if it is vital to U.S. interests? Do you think the U.S. government is equipped to encourage industry to go in there?
I think we're finding that with the Trump administration, this White House does find inducements and the way to get industries that they really, excuse me, consider important to make the moves that they would like to see happen. I think much more than previous administrations.
Very interesting. And looking ahead to beyond the DRC, but to a lot of conflicts in Africa. And I'm thinking specifically of Sudan or the Sahel, areas where the U.S. might have vested business interests or the ability to make partnerships. I think some could attribute it to this administration. Some could say that it's been a sentiment among Americans that existed and manifested in this administration. But this idea that the US is too involved militarily or diplomatically in foreign conflicts, um, and should sit on the sidelines a little more. Um, do you think that, given some of the US interests in Africa specifically, that it's worth the US taking a look at doing a lot of that on the ground work to try and rebuild business partnerships, rebuild mineral access in countries like the DRC or in Sudan or the Sahel?
Yeah, but what you have to remember is that 54 countries in Africa, and how many are actually undergoing conflict. So there are countries, say for example Guinea, that has a tremendous amount of cobalt. What's wrong with Guinea? They have a government that was formed by a coup d'etat. Uh, Historically, we've been very reluctant to deal with governments that came about because of a coup. But
Mhm.
I think even that view is changing because the nature of coups have changed, in that nowadays you have a number of coups against governments whose own legitimacy is highly suspect, because either they came into power through very questionable elections, or they extended themselves in power by changing the constitution under very questionable means. And much with the people on the ground in Africa, especially young people, because as we all know, Africa's population is mostly young people, and it's growing very, very quickly. The young people of Africa are not out there demonstrating for, democracy and elections. They're out there demonstrating for peace, stability, and economic opportunity. And oftentimes they may see a military government as more legitimate than the corrupt civilian government that military government replaced. So I think the United States needs to be a lot more flexible in who we deal with and who we don't deal with, and how we deal with them, instead of saying, oops, the soldiers, threw out President whatever his name is, and it tends to always be a he, and we're going to stop dealing with them, and we'll let them go to hell if extremists, take over their country, and we're not going to do anything if the Chinese come in and take up all the businesses and extract all the rare earths. I, that's not a very wise policy either. We need to look at these situations uniquely, and make the evaluations based on what is really going on there and how valuable would it be to the United States. I have not seen us recently advocating for free elections in Saudi Arabia, for example.
Yeah, I mean, that is always the classic example of we hate when a democratic country becomes authoritarian, but we're just fine with our persistently authoritarian partners in Saudi
Yeah,
Arabia.
yeah.
Um, so I'll ask one more question before I let you go. If you were in the room with policymakers today, whether that's the Assistant Secretary of State for Africa or Ambassador
Which we don't
Rubio,
have. We do not
true.
have an assistant secretary for Africa, nor is there a nominee, unfortunately, and we desperately need one. Although the person holding down the job is phenomenally competent, it just makes a huge difference having a Senate confirmed assistant secretary in place, because then there's a clean, it's a clear indication of this person is responsible for recommending and implementing U.S. Africa policy.
This is true. That is definitely a strategic gap. So if you were in the room with any of those policymakers or would-be policymakers, and they asked you, Ambassador Nagy, what should we do about critical minerals in Africa? Do we need them? How do we get them? What's the way to go about it? What advice, what recommendations would you provide?
My advice would be absolutely, find out where it might be the low-hanging fruit on the tree, and dedicate the energy and the resources required to go after them. Handhold the government, work with them, give it all the attention it needs. And then if it turns out that some of the places where we really, really need to go are very complicated, like the DRC, then again, apply the resources that the U.S. has available, the diplomatic, the personal, the persuasive, economic, and if need be, military advisors, not, U.S. troops on the ground, but definitely working with their military so that we can make it happen. I mean, as is has been seen, the United States is still the truly the only player in the world that can, once we get involved in some of these hot button issues, we're the ones that can bring a solution.
Very interesting. Well, thank you, Ambassador Naj, for your time. Appreciate it.
Thanks a lot, Colin, and good luck with the entire project.